Welcome to the Australia Institute's Economics Academy. I'm Richard Dennis, the Australia Institute's Chief Economist.
And I'm Matt Grudnoff, the Senior Economist.
In this episode, we're going to talk about supply and demand. Now, you've probably heard that economics is all about supply and demand, and you might have even heard that Adam Smith invented the idea of the invisible hand. The invisible hand is this idea that the powers of supply and demand shape everything. And there's some truth in that, but what we need to understand is all of those questions about how we efficiently allocate scarce resources, that opportunity costs, the forces of supply and demand are one way that we can as a society answer those questions using market forces. Isn't that right, Matt?
Exactly right. So supply and demand is an incredibly powerful tool, like we talked about earlier about opportunity cost and thinking at the margins. Well, this is another important tool in the economist's toolbox. But the thing we need to know, as well as how it works, where its limitations are. And that's what we're going to discuss today.
So you've probably heard people talk about demand. Demand for things, demand for petrol, demand for food, the forces of supply and demand. For economists, when we talk about demand, we're not talking about need. We're not talking about want. We're not talking about fare. Economists refer to demand as someone's willingness, and ability to pay. What's ability got to do with it, Matt?
Well, this kind of demand that we're talking about is not what you want, not what you need, but what you can afford. And so if you don't have any money, for example, then we don't consider you to have much demand because you don't have much of an income.
So when you have demand for something, it means you are able to walk into a shop. You're willing and able to walk into a shop and say, I'd like one of those. So when we talk about the way the market allocates scarce resources, consumer demand is the way that we tell people that want to make stuff what we want to buy. Effectively, our demand is our dollar votes. And we walk around issuing dollar votes for the things we like. So if you want to pay someone to make a coffee for you for $5 and you've got enough cash to make that happen, someone's going to want to sell you a coffee.
And if lots of people are willing to buy your coffee for $5, then you'll continue producing it and maybe expand.
Every time you vote for the product with your dollars, you're telling the shop, I like this, I think the price is okay.
And also the reverse, if you set up a coffee shop and you make crap coffee and try to sell it for $5 and nobody wants it, then you'll go broke.
So think about this willingness and ability to pay. So if I walk into a cafe and I pay $5 for a coffee and I walk out and I tell Matt that coffee was a rip-off, Matt, what would you say to me?
Well, as an economist or as a normal human being?
As an economist. You're not very normal.
I'm thinking that you're an idiot.
Well, I'm not. I'm thinking I must have thought it was worth it. So you'll hear people complain all the time. I paid $5 for a coffee, it was a rip-off. But if you own the coffee shop, what did you see? That someone came in, gave you $5 for the coffee and left. So when you pay for something, you express your willingness to buy it and your ability to buy it. All right, so what we do in economics, we love to draw our graphs. Now, keep in mind, I'm going to put price on this axis, and I'm going to put quantity on this axis. And we can take this idea of demand for something, willingness and ability to pay for it, and we can graph it. So I want to talk about willingness and ability to buy beer. You'll see why in a minute, but I think it's a good example. And a standard demand curve for a normal good, a normal product, is what we call downward sloping. Okay? And what that suggests is if the price of something is high, I won't buy very much of it. And if you drop the price, I'll buy more of it. Now, this is not an uncommon situation. There are plenty of examples of when lowering the price of something leads to people buying more of it. Matt, you got any examples for me?
Almost all goods at some point act like this. So, whether it's bananas, all right? So, if the banana season is on, the price of bananas goes down, people will buy more bananas.
You show up at the supermarket, you went there to buy apples and oranges, they're really expensive, bananas are cheap. A lot of people will see that something has got a low price, so they'll buy more of it. Now, there's two reasons for that. The main one that we're going to focus on is what's called the substitution effect. When the price of something falls, it's cheaper than the price of the substitute. So, bananas are cheap, you buy bananas instead of apples. But some things don't have as many substitutes, and we'll come to that soon. But before we do, let's talk about beer. Economic theory tends to suggest that when you lower the price of something, the demand for it will increase. The quantity demanded will increase. Now, this is likely, but not inevitable. And I want to use beer as a good example to kind of break this idea. Because price and quantity are a choice. When I've drawn this graph up, I've said I want to compare price and quantity when it comes to beer. But there's a whole bunch of things that are actually going to determine my demand for beer. Price is one of them. But Matt, what else might affect how much money I spend on beer?
Well, there's heaps of things that could potentially. We've talked about substitutes. So if cider or some other spirits or something like that was suddenly to be on sale and go down in price, then people might buy less beer.
So if the price of something else changes, I might buy less beer or more beer.
Yep, exactly right. So the change in the price of substitutes.
And I don't know, it's coming up to the weekend. Why might I buy more beer on a Friday night than I do on another night of the week? Is beer cheap on Friday nights?
No. So where we consume it and who we consume it with is also a determinant of demand. So you might want to go down to the pub because all your mates are down at the pub on a Friday night, whereas on a Wednesday morning, it might be dreary and sad, and you might look like a lone kind of drunk sort of person.
What's sad about drinking on a Wednesday morning?
We need to talk later, Richard.
So let's get this right. My demand for beer might be affected not just by the price and not just by the price of substitutes, but by something like the night of the week.
Yeah, and what other people are doing.
And what other people are doing.
Yeah, if my friends are all down there and they're all drinking a particular type of beer, behavioural economics tells us we're more likely to partake in that particular beer.
So culture has an impact on my consumption of beer, including what nights I drink it on. So how come people drink on Friday nights?
Well, it's certainly not cheaper, is it?
It's not cheaper. Happy hour usually isn't Friday night. So why Friday nights?
Well, because that's when they want to socialise, that's when they want to get together. So they're not actually necessarily going out to consume beer, they're actually going out to consume a good time. They're going out to consume being with other people.
But why do we consume that on a Friday night?
Well, because you can drink a lot of beer and wake up late on a Saturday morning, possibly not feeling the best.
So social norms and rules about when we go to work have an impact on the nights that we drink, and the nights that we drink have an impact on how much beer.
Yep.
Right. But I thought it was all about price.
No, not at all.
So how do economists get away with this? How do we tell everyone that we understand the law of demand, and the law of demand says as price falls, we buy more of something, but we've just come up with a whole list of things?
Just simple Latin, ceteris paribus.
What?
Basically, all other things assumed being equal. So if we assume that we're only talking about Friday night, we're only talking about a group of your friends, and we keep all of those other things constant over here, then we can say, if the price goes down, you'll drink more, and if the price goes up, you'll drink less, assuming that all these other things that affect beer don't change.
So the law of demand tells us that if nothing interesting happens, and there's no change in anything except the price, that all other things being equal, if nothing else changes, a reduction in the price of beer will mean people will buy more beer.
Exactly right.
So you mean the law of demand assumes away all of the big important things, like whether it's even legal to drink alcohol. We just forget about all that when we draw up our demand curve.
That's exactly right.
That's a pretty good trick.
It is a very good trick.
So the only reason that people would ever use less energy is if you made energy dearer.
Yeah, exactly right. So it wouldn't be because they were concerned about the environment and it was the source of the energy was a problem. It wouldn't be. They wouldn't be concerned about whether it was a hot summer afternoon and they wanted to run their air conditioning. It would only be based on price.
And they wouldn't know anything about insulating their house, and they wouldn't know anything about putting trees to shade their house. The law of demand says the only way to get people to use less energy is to make them pay more for it.
That's right.
Yeah. So when we talk about the law of demand, it's an important, powerful effect. And, Matt's right. If bananas are cheap, people will probably buy more of them. Reducing the price of something can and often will result in people buying more of something, but it's not the only thing that determines demand. And when we get caught up thinking that price is the only thing that matters, it forces us to have really often painful conversations about, carbon pricing, for example, which, to be clear, every economist thinks is a good idea, but there are still lots of other things you can do to get people to use energy. So Matt, I'm just going to draw up a supply curve now, but remind us again what ceteris paribus means.
It basically means all other things being equal. So essentially, we're saying that if you had two identical cases, so it was Friday night, it was the same pub, it was the same group of people, they were in the same mood. If you had a higher price, right, you would drink less beer, and if it was a lower price, you would drink more beer. And also at the same point in the night, because we know that beer actually goes up in price late in the evening, right, when everybody's drunk, okay, and people still buy it.
Are you saying people aren't always rational when they make decisions?
People are very irrational.
No, they can't be, because I've seen people who will do a U-turn over a double yellow line to save $0.01 a litre on their petrol. So people must be rational. They must be obsessed with price.
And then they go in and buy a $2 bottle of water from the shop.
What's your point?
The water out of the tap might be a little bit cheaper than $2 a bottle.
So demand matters and price matters. It's just not the only thing. And when we talk about the law of demand, we need to understand that the law of demand assumes away a whole bunch of important things. Now let's talk about the supply curve. What's a supply curve, Matt?
So the demand curve is basically consumers' willingness and ability to pay. The supply curve is firms' willingness and ability to supply, to produce the goods. And so again, we have price, right? So when the price is higher, we would expect that firms would be willing to supply a larger quantity because they can make a bigger profit. And when the price is low, lots of firms are going to think, well, I don't want to supply that. So less firms supplying, the quantity will be lower.
So let's use the classic example. When I say classic, I mean hundreds of years ago, someone thought this up example, and it used to 100 years ago.
Probably Adam Smith.
Probably Adam Smith had a little to do with all this. Let's take the classic example of agriculture. So what we're doing here is we're saying, what's the relationship between the price that you can sell something for and the quantity that someone will produce? So imagine you owned a farm, which a couple of hundred years ago was not an unlikely thing because most people used to work in agriculture. So you own a farm and you're going to plant a crop of potatoes. Where on your farm, of all the places, would you plant your first crop of potatoes? Matt, you like a potato?
I do like a potato. So you'd probably plant it in a couple of different places. The best place, given the soil, so you're going to produce the most. The best place in convenience, so close to perhaps the road where you can
or your house where you wake up in the morning.
Exactly right. So basically the most optimal spot where you're going to get the most potatoes with the least amount of effort.
Right, so a smart farmer would think, all right, I own all this land, of all the places to plant my first crop, I'm going to plant it where the soil's pretty fertile, close to my house so I don't have to walk too far, and ideally not too far from the town I'm going to sell the potatoes for. So what that allows us to do is say, well, if a smart producer was going to make one, bag of potatoes, they'd plant the potatoes on the fertile land closest to their house. Take the potatoes to market, sell it, everyone's happy, everyone loved Matt's potatoes so much, says, Matt, why don't you grow some more potatoes? So Matt, where would you plant your second crop of potatoes on your farm?
Well, I'd look around my farm and go to that spot that isn't quite as good as the first spot, but isn't as bad as the rest of the farm. So the second best spot.
The second best spot. So by definition, you're going to plant potatoes in land that's slightly less fertile and has slightly higher transport and other costs.
Yep. So it's going to cost me a little bit more.
So the more potatoes you produce, you're going to have to keep moving away from your farm and you're going to have to keep moving on to less and less fertile ground, which means we get what economists call an upward sloping supply curve, which basically says as you want to produce more of something, the cost of producing it goes up. Now, this is like, no economist will argue with this, but I know everyone watching is thinking, that's crazy. This is the exact opposite of how production works. Everyone knows that the more you produce, the cheaper it gets. Mass production, economies of scale, means the exact opposite of this upward sloping supply curve. Well, that's a conundrum. Economists can explain it. We explain it quite simply by saying, well, it's upward sloping for some things, like potatoes. It's just not upward sloping for, I don't know, cars, bikes.
Pretty much anything that's
software.
manufacturing.
Anything manufactured pretty much anywhere, the law of supply doesn't hold for. Now, economists aren't stupid. Like, we know this stuff. And it's pretty easy to say, well, what if the cost of making something fell for a while and then started to rise? Okay, so we've jumped out of our potato farm now into a car factory. It gets cheaper and cheaper to make cars the more you make, but at some point the factory kind of gets full, and then the costs of producing start to rise.
You're starting to have to put on the night shift, you've got to pay them double time.
People are bumping into each other in the loading docks, right? So at some point the factory gets close to capacity and the supply curve starts to increase. And economists go, aha, I was right. The law of supply holds. So just like the law of demand is kind of useful, kind of sometimes a bit, the law of supply is kind of useful, kind of sometimes a bit. And as citizens, as economists, as people interested in how the world works, we really have to know that the law of supply is far more complicated than it's often made out to be, and the law of demand is far more complicated than it's made out to be, and that this thing that we call the supply curve is radically different in the software industry than it is in the potato industry, and radically different from the health industry, and radically different from the mining industry. So for all of the different things we can produce, we need to have a much more detailed think about what happens when supply and demand interact. Because for some products, we get these enormous economies of scale, which means making lots of stuff in one place is great. And in other things, the more we produce in the one place, the dearer it gets. So the key point, and we'll combine supply and demand in a second, but the key point here is to understand there's no one size fits all. And Adam Smith's invisible hand, or the forces of supply and demand, are so much more complicated. The law of supply and law of demand is so much more complicated than the law of gravity, because every time I chuck this to Matt,
I'm going to drop this, you watch.
every time the law of gravity, the laws of physics work every single time. But the law of supply kind of works sometimes a bit. And the law of demand kind of works sometimes a bit. And every time I throw the pen, I'm kind of banking on the fact that, well, not only can Matt catch and throw, but that the laws will be the same. But when we set out to design policy for energy efficiency, or the provision of schools, or the provision of healthcare, or the manufacture of pens, every single industry is actually different. And we really need to understand that the laws of supply and laws of demand have to be broken down into the specifics if we're really going to understand them. All right, so let's combine, Matt, the supply and demand.
So Richard, we drew a demand curve and we drew a supply curve, but how from that curve can I work out what the market price is going to be?
Right, so here's our demand curve, keeping in mind that the demand curve for a particular product assumes away all sorts of things. So here's our demand curve for a product. We'll call it beer. And here's our supply curve.
And so we've got price up here.
So we've got price up here, and we've got quantity down here. Now keep in mind that the demand curve is only describing the behaviour of consumers. One group in society, the people who walk around with money in their wallets thinking, what am I going to buy? The demand curve describes consumer behaviour, and the supply curve describes supplier behaviour. And if the price of something is really low, people aren't going to want to supply it. They think it's not worth my time to grow my potatoes.
But lots of people.
But if the price is really low, lots of people want to buy it. So what happens with the invisible hand, what happens with market forces, is that what we're looking for is what economists call equilibrium or market clearing. At this low price, we don't get many suppliers showing up. So let's talk about fish, not beer. All right, we'll go to the fish market. Everyone knows what a fish market's like. Fish market's got a whole bunch of people selling fish, a whole bunch of people buying fish, big cold shed, smells like fish. If the price of fish is really low, the suppliers of fish won't bother going fishing. Right? The people that make potatoes or catch fish or do whatever, if the price is too low, most of them won't be bothered doing it. But a whole bunch of customers would show up. So Matt, what would happen at the fish market on the day that price was down here?
All the fish would get sold really quickly and lots of people would go home unhappy.
Right, so this amount of fish gets sold, people wanted this much fish, whole bunch of grumpy customers. Now keep in mind, no one's ever happy in economics, are they, Matt?
No, never.
So in this environment
including economists.
Well, because they won't listen to us. So in this environment, we've got a whole bunch of people who feel aggrieved because they missed out. They wanted to buy a lot of fish, tried to buy a lot of fish, but because the price was so low, not a lot of fish got supplied. So next weekend, let's do a higher price. Price is really high. Heaps of fish got supplied to the market. See, this is coming off the supply curve. But the price was so high that at that price, not that many people were willing and able to buy fresh fish. They went and bought vegetables or chicken or some other substitute. So if the price is up here, the amount supplied is a lot greater than people's willingness and ability to buy it. So in week one, when the price was low, we had all these upset consumers who missed out. In week two, we've got all these aggrieved fisher people saying, oh, this is terrible. We all showed up with all the fish and couldn't sell it.
And we've got a lot of stinky fish that are going off.
Got a lot of stinky fish. Now, economists get very excited about this point here. That point is what we call equilibrium. Now, what happens here at equilibrium is that this is the one and only price on this diagram where for any particular price, the amount of fish that people are willing and able to buy is exactly equal to the amount of fish that people were willing and able to sell. So when we get to this point of equilibrium, that's what economists call market clearing. We say that the market has found its equilibrium, and an equilibrium is simply a point of rest. A point of rest means the price isn't under pressure to go up or down. It's just going to stay there. Now, equilibrium's interesting. It's economically interesting. It tells us that this is the one and only price where the benefits that people get from demand, the consumer benefits of the fish, are equal to the cost to the supplier of producing the fish. So equilibrium is economically interesting because it's the one and only point where the amount of money people are willing to pull out of their wallet to buy the fish, I'm willing to pay $20 a kilo for it, it's exactly equal to the supplier's willingness to supply fish.
So does that mean, Richard, at that point, everybody's happy?
No. It means
we're never happy.
No one's ever happy, right? This is what you have to know.
If you want to understand laws of economics,
the one law is that no one's ever happy. What all equilibrium tells us is that in the fish market, the amount of effort going into catching fish and the benefits that I get from fish are now about equal.
So if the demand curve shows a consumer's preference for something, how much they want, if I'm a consumer that's willing to pay P1 right? And the price is up here at P star at $20.
You're not happy.
I'm not happy. I'm not getting my fish at my price.
So we say that we're in equilibrium in the fish market, but the price of fish is much higher than the price that these people were willing to pay on the first day. And also, so you've got a whole bunch of customers going, oh, this is outrageous. Look at the price of fish. Who can afford to pay that? That's a rip-off. But it's not just the consumers that are upset. What we've also got is a whole bunch of people who are willing and able to supply fish, but who had to travel so far to catch the fish or had to spend so much on fuel to catch the fish. We've got a whole bunch of suppliers. What are they whinging about, Matt?
They're saying the price is too low. I can't possibly afford to supply the market.
Look at this.
Price. I go broke.
If the price was a little bit higher, I'd be willing and able to supply fish, but at these ridiculously low prices, I'd go broke. So economics is not about everyone being happy. Supply and demand and equilibrium and the magical invisible hand isn't about making everyone happy. It's trying to figure out who should be unhappy. The efficient allocation of scarce resources. There's no scenario here where everyone's happy. If the price is too low, it sells out really fast. If the price is too high, you're left with a whole bunch of unsold fish. The market clearing price is just the price where there's no leftover fish at the end of the day. But a whole bunch of consumers have still missed out, and a whole bunch of suppliers could supply more, but they're not going to supply more at that price. So market forces, the forces of supply and the forces of demand, have a big impact on who gets what. It's really important. But equilibrium doesn't mean everybody's happy. Now, Matt, I'm just going to draw up some different supply and demand curves now to kind of explain how this might move around. The question I want you to answer while I'm drawing that up is, how does advertising affect the equilibrium in the market? What happens if we convince everyone that fish is the best thing in the world?
That's a really good question. So let's say that the fish market goes on an advertising spree. Well, two things are going to happen. If the advertising spree was successful, then more people are going to want to buy fish. So that means that the demand curve is going to shift out. More people are going to want to buy fish at a given price.
Well, hold that, Matt. I just want to show that before I draw it up. So remember, we had our demand curve before, and we said all other things being equal. All other things being equal. Well, now we're going to change something. We're not stupid in economics. We've got very simple diagrams, but we know they never capture all of it. So if this is the demand for fish, before we run an advertising campaign, it says that for any given price, people are going to buy a certain amount of fish. But then Matt, who's not just a very good economist, but a creative genius, makes an ad that says, if you eat more fish, you will be so attractive to the people you wish desired you, and you will live a long, happy, healthy life, and you'll be popular. And there's an ad, you can imagine the ad with everyone happy at Matt's house eating fish. You've never seen such happy people in your life. So let's assume ads work. Wouldn't work on you, but they work on other people. What we can do through something like advertising is fundamentally change people's tastes and preferences. Again, it wouldn't work on you, but other people buy things after they've seen an ad showing how happy and attractive a product can make them. So what that means is, to represent that, we say, well, we have to draw a whole new demand curve because the world has changed. This was the demand curve before Matt made his ad. This is the demand curve after Matt made his ad. And let's assume the supply curve hasn't changed. What that means is, after the ads, people are more willing and more able, so more people are now rushing off to the fish market, and the people who are there value fish more than they ever valued it before, and as a consequence, we've got a new equilibrium. After the ad, I'll do it, Matt, I'm good at this.
Straight lines is your speciality.
And what the ad's done is driven up the price, the market price, and it's led to an increase in the amount of something that's being consumed. So there's lots of things about the supply and demand curves that we can influence. One of the main ones that we also need to talk about is what's called the elasticity of demand. What's elasticity mean, Matt?
Well, elasticity means how sensitive consumers are to a change in price. So different goods have different sensitivities. So, for example, cigarettes, all right, if the price goes up, people aren't really sensitive to changes. They're going to continue to smoke. But things like bananas that we talked about earlier, if the price of bananas goes up much, people will very quickly stop buying bananas.
All right, let's do cigarettes first. So I've drawn this demand curve very steep, because what it suggests is that if we increase the price a lot, we don't actually get much reduction in demand. So a big increase in price leads to a small reduction in demand. Why is that, Matt? You're a big smoker.
Don't tell my mum. So the reason is it's all about substitutes, right? So if you smoke and the price of cigarettes goes up, or the price of tobacco more generally goes up, then in order to get that nicotine hit, there aren't many other ways you're going to actually be able to get it. And so because you can't easily change to a different good, then, and you really want that good because you're addicted to it, then you're going to continue to buy the good even if the price is high.
Okay, but what about bananas? I've just drawn a really flat demand curve, which suggests that if the price, I'm going to use red pen now, gravity works, okay. So if I increase the price of bananas just a little bit, I get a much bigger reduction in the quantity demanded. So I get a little change in price for bananas, and I get a big reduction in the amount of bananas people buy. Why are bananas different from cigarettes?
Well, they're actually the same force is working on them, and that is substitutes again. If you rock up and a cyclone's wiped out all the banana crop in northern Queensland and the price has gone up, then you're going to go, well, sorry kids, no bananas today, you can have an apple instead, or an orange. Or a Tangelo. I've got a friend who loves Tangelos.
What's a Tangelo?
I don't know. It's a foul-tasting orange, from what I can tell. But basically, they will seek out other fruit because there are lots of things that are similar to bananas. Not exactly the same as bananas, and there are some people who will continue to buy bananas because they really love bananas. And the quantity didn't go to zero, so we know that. But there are things that are fairly similar as far as people are concerned, and they're going to stop buying bananas and they'll buy something else.
So everything about the laws of supply and the laws of demand are not very lawly. So the idea that the demand curve is downward sloping is a convenience, but not a fact. Matt?
So imagine you're selling Ferraris, right? And you want to sell more Ferraris. Do you think that the best way to sell more Ferraris is to cut them and compete with Commodores? No, okay? Why? Because a lot of Ferrari's value comes from the fact that they are exclusive, that not everybody has a Ferrari, that when you're driving down the road, you can imagine that everybody's looking at you going, wow, he's got a Ferrari, she's got a Ferrari, isn't that great? They must be very special, important people. And that glow that you have from imagining that people are thinking that, all right, has value, and that's what you're paying for. You're paying for that exclusivity. So therefore, paradoxically, if the price of Ferraris went down, you might almost expect that the number of Ferraris sold would also go down.
Well, in an extreme, I reckon there's plenty of Commodore loving hoons would buy a cheap Ferrari.
True.
But what Matt's talking about are what we call prestige goods. And a prestige good is a product whose main attribute is its expense. So I'm told there are $40,000 handbags. I believe this is true. I have done no research.
You don't have a $40,000 handbag?
Not yet. Saving up for one. But my elasticity of demand is a little high. So for some people, the fact that it's the most expensive handbag, or as Matt said, the most expensive car, that's the reason to buy it. Now, a lot of people, not you, but other people fall for this all the time. They go to the shops and they see luxury brand baked beans and Povo brand baked beans, and they think,
if the baked beans are more expensive, they must be better, right?
Must be better.
The quality, price and quality are exactly the same thing, aren't they?
Yeah, and there must be a factory out there that makes kind of all right but not great baked beans.
Yeah.
You imagine the job ad, come and work here. We're not poisonous, just not very good.
And then you've got the luxury brand baked beans, which is in a completely different location.
Come and work at the luxury baked bean factory. We're looking for people with real attention to detail.
Who love beans.
Who love their beans and know their beans. So people fall for this premium, prestige, good stuff all the time. And we think it's about Ferraris, and we think it's about handbags, but it's about ice cream. It's about baked beans. It's about everything. And now that doesn't mean...
2-minute noodles. You can buy expensive 2-minute noodles.
Oh, but the flavour sachets, Matt.
The flavour, it's all about the flavour sachets.
Unbelievable. So the fact that demand curves tend to be downward sloping often, sometimes a bit, is useful to know. But when we tell ourselves that it's always like that, the idea of the law of demand completely gets in the way of asking ourselves what other levers are available, and can we change behaviour through culture? Can we change behaviour through regulation? Can we change behaviour through technology? The answer is yes, and economics can help us understand all those other options, but not if everyone thinks there's a law of demand and this is how people behave. So it's entirely possible for demand curves to be upward sloping. It's entirely possible for demand for something to just be insensitive to price. People just don't care. Like they just walk into the shop and buy it and they don't even look. All right, and sure, if the price got high enough, they might stop. But does anyone really stop buying Tic Tacs because they got a bit exy? All right, if you feel like a Tic Tac, you buy some Tic Tacs. All right, so sometimes price has no impact, sometimes it has a lot, sometimes it goes the other way. Again, we always, as citizens and as consumers, we have to look carefully at these things. Right, so to wrap up, economics is about the efficient allocation of scarce resources. Economics is trying to help us answer the question, how many bananas should we make and who should we give them to? How many cigarettes should we make and who should we give them to? How much electricity should we generate? How much bottled water? All of these questions need answering all day long, every day long. 25 million people in Australia walk into shops and expect stuff to be there. And the forces of supply and demand are central to answering all of those questions every single day. But that doesn't mean that the answers are good answers. It doesn't mean that we as citizens or as consumers can't change the answers. And when people tell you something like groceries in Australia are expensive because of the forces of supply and demand, it doesn't mean anything.
What about when they say, demand's outstripping supply?
Meaningless, right? None of these phrases. Imagine if a plane crashed and someone said, why did the plane crash? And someone said, the force of gravity, right? It's meaningless, right? Everything about the demand for something can be influenced by a multitude of factors. Everything about the supply of something can be influenced by a multitude of factors. And these complicated demand curves and these complicated supply curves bump into each other and generate a price depending on a whole bunch of things. And we can influence that through our own behaviour, we can influence that through regulation, it can be influenced over time by technological change. It's all up for grabs. But unfortunately, the main lesson that people often get out of economics is it's beyond our control and the forces of supply and demand have done it. Well, if you don't think that a good excuse for a plane crash is that it was the force of gravity that did it, never believe that the forces of supply and demand are why you pay too much for some products and other things are massively underpriced. We do these things for free because we really love helping people understand economics. But if you can like, share, or subscribe to our service, that'd be great.